just after sunrise. They were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, "Who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb?" But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. "Don't be alarmed," he said. "You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you." Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Romans 8, verses 10 to 12. "But if Christ is in you, then even though your body is subject to death because of sin, the Spirit gives life because of righteousness. And if the Spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead is living in you," Flatlands, "he who raised Christ from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies." Why? Because of his Spirit who lives in you. Therefore, brothers and sisters, we have an obligation, but it is not to the flesh to live according to it. This is the word of God for the people of God. It has been said that a picture is worth 1,000 words. And to that end, it has also been said, and something that I was taught, that it's better to see a sermon than to hear one. And I believe that as we listen to the account that Mark provides, that for those in the first century who went to the tomb, who arrived at the empty tomb, that the first message they received about what happened to Jesus, it wasn't an audible message. It wasn't an interaction and an encounter with the resurrected Jesus, but rather it was a series of images and visual depictions that God used to communicate a new and a profound truth. A truth about God's power over the wickedness perpetrated by evil actors, darkness, and the spiritual forces that have ravaged the lives of God's people and that continue to this day to make life on earth a hellish experience. Instead of telling people what God had done, God chose this particular moment in history to build his case as a prosecutor would by presenting visible, tangible pieces of evidence. And each piece of evidence spoke for itself. And I believe that it still speaks to us today, testifying and standing on its own merit about what God did and what only God could have done. For the women in Mark's account, these women that first arrived at the tomb, they discovered something that anyone who desires to walk with God and to follow Jesus must come to understand. That God does not always speak to us verbally. But very often, God uses multiple and various means to communicate with you and I. That before a person encounters the person of God, God usually provides, God offers signs and symbols, images, visual depictions of his presence and his activity in our lives and around us. That before we encounter him, we'll see him. And very often, church, it's through the visual that God reveals God's self, that God reveals aspects of his plan and his purposes for you and I. That it's through the visual that God will reveal dimensions of his power and the delivery of his promises. And when we come to understand that it is not only important to listen to and for the voice of God, but it is also important to pay attention. To pay attention to the things that God is showing us. To pay attention to the things that God is allowing us to see. And if we do that, you and I may find out that it's in the things that God is showing us that God is also providing answers to our questions. Hello. Solutions to our situations and resources for our recovery. They asked each other, who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb? What a question. You know, when you think about a stone, the stone not only posed a physical obstacle to getting into the tomb. But how many of us know that the stone was also a barrier to getting out of the tomb? And so on one level, the stone speaks about the obstacles that you and I will face in life. You know, those things that stand in our way, the limitation that very often hinder us from accomplishing our objectives. Or how about those immovable objects that you and I lack the physical strength or the resources to remove? The truth is that each of us either is or will face some stones in our life. We will face some things that will prevent us from getting to things that we want. Or how about this? Getting out of some places where we feel trapped. The stone. The stone reminds us that sometimes the reasons we haven't advanced in our careers, sometimes the reason we haven't been able to get out of some of the things that are unhealthy for us isn't because we're lazy. It isn't because we lack the skill set. It isn't because we don't have what it takes. But it's simply because we've got some immovable objects in our path. We've got some things in front of us that are making it impossible for us to access or for us to escape. I wish y'all were a little more lively this morning, but that's okay. That's all right. I guess we in school, so I'll lecture. But it works better if you talk back to me now. But if we also remember this, that the stone had a purpose, right? That sometimes God intentionally leaves some immovable objects in your path. And when you understand that, it changes the dynamic. It changes the equation, right? It changes our prayer life. Because if God leaves it there, then it's because God's got a purpose for it. But when they looked up, they saw the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. And so to these women's surprise, this great, big, immovable object had been moved already. That God had done for them, hello somebody, what they could not do for themselves. You know, this is going to shock some people, right? But the reason that God sometimes leaves some stones in the path of his people is because God needs his people to know that there's some things that only God can remove. That immovable object you're facing, it is intended to remind you and I of our human limitations. But on the other hand, the stone being rolled away testifies that the things that limit you and I, they don't limit God. That God is not limited by the same things that limit people. That God is not bound by the same hindrances, the same obstacles, the same hurdles, and the things that you and I perceive as limiting factors. The stone was rolled away. God speaking loud and clearly that I have the power to create and to open up, to create opportunities for you that you didn't even think were there, to open up avenues when you didn't see anyway. The truth is that if God doesn't remove that stone, they can't get in. They don't have any access. And they are unable to do the things that they are intending to do. And so this is one of those places where faith intersects with life. Right? That when you realize that God has the power, faith changes your posture towards life. Faith isn't afraid or too proud to admit that I can't, but God can. Faith stands on the principle that if only God can do it, then I'm going to wait for God to do it. As they entered the tomb, surprise, surprise, they saw an angel. I would have fainted and had a heart attack. First of all, no body and an angel, oh, Jesus. Right? They saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side. The help that God provides. Lord Jesus. The last thing they expected to see was an angel. But the angelic presence, church, speaks to us. It reminds us that God's help comes from unlikely sources in unexpected ways, at times when we needed it, but weren't looking for it. That the angelic presence reminds us today, Flatlands, that God will interject himself into our seasons of discouragement. That God will provide the help that we need when you and I are groping around in the darkness of confusion and uncertainty looking for answers. That God will provide the solution to our situation. But the angel also tells another story. That while God provides help for his people, sometimes God's people reject God's help. No one at Flatlands now, but we're just saying, within the body, right? That sometimes, because God's help doesn't come from the source we'd prefer, sometimes God's help doesn't take the form we'd like it to take. Sometimes, again, no one at Flatlands, but sometimes, we're just too proud to accept or to receive God's help. But the help that God provided, the help that God offered, provided them with the direction that they needed. Please don't reject God's help. Whatever form the help God provides you takes, don't reject God's help. The angel said, "You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him." These women came to the tomb fully expecting to see a dead Jesus. But instead, what they saw was an empty tomb. And while they didn't initially grasp the message of the empty tomb, the angel made it clear that God has fought and God has won. God has fought against the demonic forces that have tried to wreck God's creation and the lives of God's people, and God has won. God has fought against death, and God has won. God has fought against sickness, suffering, and all of the other hellish things that you and I experience in this life, and God has won. But the Apostle Paul goes on to help us understand the actual implication of God's victory and the empty tomb, what it actually means for us today, right? Paul says, "But if Christ is in you, then even though your body is subject to death because of sin, the Spirit gives life." In other words, church, you and I will taste death. Yes, it is part of the human experience. But praise be to God, there's something on the other side of death, and that's life with God. But that's the afterlife. I need to know about this life. What you got to say, Paul? Paul says that if the Spirit of Jesus lives in you, then the same Spirit that raised Jesus from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies. In other words, recovery is possible. That you and I can come back from life's disappointments. We can come back from life's devastating experiences. We can come back from failure, rejection, and depression because of the Spirit of God. The same Spirit that raised Jesus, that now lives in the followers of Jesus. Jesus' followers, hear me. We can recover from whatever we face and go through in this life. And so the message of the empty tomb is this: that whatever doesn't take you out, the Spirit of Jesus will help you to recover from. And whatever does take you out, the Spirit of Jesus will usher you into God's eternal safekeeping presence. And so it's a win-win for Jesus followers. You can't lose by following Jesus. And let me say this. Some of you, I probably won't see till this time next year, and that's okay. That's okay. But Kathy Keller made this observation: the stone being rolled away wasn't to let Jesus out, but it was to let people in. And so today, God is inviting skeptics, agnostics, and anyone else here, whether you're watching us virtually or in person, whoever may be struggling with faith or trusting God, God is asking you today to take one step closer, just one. And with each step you take, God declares that he will reveal and prove himself to you. And so normally at this time, I pray for you. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to ask you to just go before the Lord. If you want to experience that resurrection power that the scriptures speak of, just go before God and take that step if you haven't received Jesus. And as we prepare to leave this place today, let us stand